courage and determination in seeing down legal threat when it comes to their minimum alcohol pricing, I expect the same on land.
Hmm.
If they think they're going to lose, try it. Try it. Because people right across Scotland are crying out for some sort of democracy, some sort of reality to the rhetoric about equality. And one of the biggest things that gives people an even chance is knowing that they can have access to land to do whatever projects they want, or they can live on the land. We could start new villages on the land. We could have people in diverse ways using all the land for all sorts of different farming exploits, or just small plots. We could change the face of Scotland, but we can't do that if it just looks too difficult to annoy 432 people.
Why do you think there is that lack of will? You're saying it is a lack of will, but if you're saying that they are so brave to take on the alcohol industry, but they're not so brave to take on the landowners, why might that be?
Well, I mean, I don't know for really. I mean, I'm not a member of the SNP and I'm not party to any of their particular thinking on this. The only things that I've noticed are that to be able to do quite a lot of the other policies that the SNP have prioritised, they've had to have landowners on side. So, for example, if you take the energy policy that we should be, basically producing our energy self-sufficient by 2020, you don't get that without putting a lot of wind turbines up fast on land. Well, where are you going to put them? The easiest thing has been to put them on large estates so that we have the nonsense of a Tory MSP like Jamie Grigger. I mean, he's a nice enough guy, but he's a landowner who has made millions and is going to make millions for the turbines on his land at the same time as his party opposes wind turbines.
Hmm.
So, what's happened is to be able to meet that target, it's just whatever gets you through the night. And equally, there's a target to reforest Scotland. We certainly do need more tree cover, but we could use it in a way that isn't basically cellulose factories and just, more expanses of industrial spruce. But again, what's the quickest way to get tree cover? If you're going to have to do something different with land, you're going to have to get landowners in. So I think the difficulty is for the SNP, they've had the landowners in the door talking to them about all sorts of different policies. And it's quite hard to turn round, I think, and then say, and just by the by, we need to break up your land holdings. But I think that's a dynamic.
Sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't.
Well, sort of, but I don't really think that's the right way of looking at it. I realise for people who have no great contact with the towns and villages and rural areas of Scotland, in which actually more people live than Edinburgh and Glasgow, it seems like a sort of distant, kind of problem that you could just overlook and skip over. And yet, if you spend any amount of time there, you realise how this riddles Scotland with a deference culture, a sort of looking over your shoulder quality and an expectation that wherever you go will be wrong. And that deep seated expectation that you just can't do something is such a hugely deadening impact on us and has had massive problems from the independence referendum to practically anything else you care to mention, including our health. So I think this is a relatively straightforward question for a government which has the backing of the Labour Party and the Lib Dems and the Greens. It's only the Tories who are in opposition on this one. Now, if you can't put the ball through the net with this, I really wonder.
Hmm. To move it on then to the city, one of the things I was looking through your document before, and you talked at the beginning about developers and land that's being left derelict. And there's actually much more derelict land than there is vacant in the cities, which seems something unusual that they really need to be working on. But there was another point, just what you're saying about, this feeling of everything you do is wrong. I think it also has an effect on people when they see so much derelict land or derelict things or decrepit buildings. That also has an effect on how people think about, their surroundings, and it can even have quite a
Yeah,
depressing
sure.
effect.
Absolutely. I think this, I can't remember if the statistic that people who live in the most deprived areas of our cities, about half of them are within 500 yards of dereliction. And I mean, that to me just gives people everything they need to know about the lack of control they have locally, for starters, the lack of impetus there is, the fact that they are almost just an assorted piece of rubbish on a building rubbish tip. And and the fact, as it goes on for year after year, that no one sees anything unusual about that. And this all has to stop. For example, places like Glasgow, when we were doing this campaign and I was organising pictures for the first spread in the National and had managed to persuade Elaine C. Smith to just take a wee minute out of rehearsal and dip somewhere where she could hold a slogan for us, I was scratching my head thinking, where would be a place to meet in Glasgow that would definitely be derelict? It was a strange kind of thing to have to think of. And then I thought for a minute and thought about Tradeston, which is that bit over the Jamaica Street Bridge. And you could pretty well just look on Google Maps, find a road junction, tell them to meet there, and know that they would be within, they'd have a choice of derelict buildings to sit in front of. And in fact, that's what happened. Now, that area I came across from Belfast in 1973. I don't think that area has changed since then. What's that, sort of 40 years? That's all just sat there, prime and a prime area right beside the centre of Glasgow. And it just looks like the place that time forgot. Well, why? And why's nobody even raised questions about it? Why can't we find out? So, yeah, I think this is hugely damaging to people's sense of optimism about the possibility of change. Because for as much as politicians talk about creating a new Scotland, people are going back to the old one. And the old one allows any old sort of rubbish to sit there simply because someone bought it and then no questions were asked.
But the unusual thing about that, particularly, like I'm from the West End of Glasgow, which is a very nice place to grow up, and there, the developers are basically fighting over every square inch and trying to get people who've owned shops in various parts booted off the land so they can put up more flats. And this seems
Mm-hmm.
unusual when they're scrapping with the public, they're developers, but then ignoring large other sites. I mean, it seems a very unusual situation, particularly when there could be some kind of law to incentivize the use of these derelict places rather than trying to fight each other for every scrap in the West End.
But I suppose that's it. We've got to a stage where that area of Tradeston, who would want to go and live there the way it is? It takes some really big, strong planning to be able to change some of these things around. I mean, I'm very close to Dundee, and I'm sort of technically, it's one of the few badges that I've ever prepared to wear is a Dundee champion, because that city has fairly turned around a lot of the waterfront. Sure enough, a lot of the rest of the city is in a terrible state, as people will see from the programme that's on the Beeb at the moment about the food bank. But there's been a concerted effort to try to make attractive what was once derelict and totally unappealing. You need to do much the same thing with something like Tradeston and have a very a big zoned project and aim a lot of energy at it. But at the moment, the pattern across the whole of Scotland and Edinburgh and Glasgow in particular is that when developers get their hands on land, they land bank it so that they can wait and basically have like a Mexican standoff with the councils until they get permission to build high-end residential flats, because that's where the biggest profits are. Now, generally, a lot of these waterfront areas in particular are not zoned necessarily for that. I was at a protest in the Our Land campaign in Arbroath, where there's been a vacant derelict site on the seafront that's part of what's zoned for leisure and recreation. And the owners there have been out 10 years to just try and walk the council down. Got so much that's sitting there because developers are hanging out for what will make the most money for them. And in the meantime, they have no penalty on it. We had a Nordic Horizons meeting this last week, and we had folk over from Copenhagen who had a sort of festival in Edinburgh called CityLink, slightly unfortunate title, talking about what's happened in Copenhagen. Communities and artists and small businesses have been able to work together and take over empty factories, schools, council offices, whatever, on leases of 2 to 5 years. And the reason is because they will then pay the land tax that empty property is accumulating. As in, there's a reason, there's an incentive for companies and businesses in Denmark to let the local people in.
Hmm.
And there is no incentive here.
Would it be grossly unfair to suggest the law, if you don't do something with it within 10 years, you lose it?
I don't think so. I mean, Commonweal, who are a big part of the Our Land campaign, Robin McAlpine's just got a very good phrase for that, which is use it or lose it. Proactive planning is something that other countries do, and it's something we need to tackle. But I think that's an entirely fair way to look at it. And You either have to intervene in statutory ways or you start to impose taxes on land which does it for you. And we do neither.
Do you think the problem in the cities is in part that the developers are too hand in hand with local councils, not wishing to name any names in particular, but I've been involved in a couple of campaigns trying to stop a developer here and there, and it did seem to myself and other members of the campaign that the developers and the council were pretty much of the same feeling, which was not the one of the people, basically.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of allegations like this. And since so many councils have hitherto sat in the same political control for decades, it fosters a belief, I'm sure, amongst the Mr. Bigs of the world that the best way to get permission to do stuff around a city or town is simply to kind of cozy up to the council. And I know there's other cities where there's been suggestions that particular builders have gone round and basically paid almost sweeteners to farmers around particular towns so that when the inevitable expansion occurred, they would be the favoured contractors to build on those areas. So
And then if they decide not to build, nothing happens.
yes. Yeah, well, there's a lot of questions to be asked, I think, just about the degree to which building contracts seem to land with the same volume house builders. In fact, if you wanted to look at the whole business of where contracts land in Scotland, you could have a whole other podcast, and you should, because that is another thing that keeps small operators very often completely out of purchase because they can't compete with people who have got the land already and who are counting on the cost of the land to make their profits. I mean, as Andy has often said, if the amount of money was put into the building and design of houses that's put into the cost of the land, we would have brilliant houses instead of houses that are killing people. And I exaggerate not. Our houses are so badly insulated and so cold, being stone very often, and so damp that it's a factor in the hypothermia, which shamefully kills and will kill pensioners again, particularly this winter in Scotland, when people who live in the Arctic parts of all the Nordic countries do not have this problem.
And also the houses that we live in are the smallest in Western Europe as well, the smallest.
So there's a whole lot of stuff that flows from that and shapes so much expectations, your health, your feeling of security. All these things make up the kind of like the emotional appetite that someone has left for civic action. And if everything around you is small, contingent, over expensive, and that's just the norm, and you have problems heating it, that's just standard. That's become the Scottish way. And it's shocking when you go, it's shocking in a good way, when you go to any of the Nordic countries, with all the heaviest stuff that you can possibly find, thinking you're going to be freezing or outside, but you're sweltering the rest of the time.
Yeah, it's not good enough, the situation we have at the moment. So,
No, and it all fits together.
so what is this organisation, Our Land, trying to do about it? And I know you've got events around the country. Could you explain a bit more about the organisation?
Well, organisation is probably putting it a bit strongly. It's a group of people. There's Jen Stout from the Scottish Land Action Movement, Andy Whiteman, who from Andy Whiteman, the Common Wheel, Women for Indy, and myself. And we came together because we had this worry. I think it was probably me that kind of pulled everyone together. Had this worry that the land reform bill will actually change very little. That it lacks bite. It's pulled its punches. It's been co-opted by lawyers, and it's not going to change a situation in Scotland where land costs about 50 to 60,000 pounds for a third of an acre, which is the average building site, which is dramatically more than it costs at this latitude in Northern Europe anywhere else. So until we change that, whichever way you do it, until that's the objective, that we bring the price of land down, we will simply continue along the lines we have at the moment. And our aim immediately was to try to make that clear to people that the land reform bill that's in front of us at the moment is just a start, and a pretty tentative one at that, and that it needs beefed up. It needs that EU registration requirement put back in, and it also needs to remove the exemption from tax on derelict and vacant land immediately. And we want the Parliament to recognise that they need to bring land reform bills in, probably in every Parliament, from now until we get to the objective of having affordable, available land. And that's kind of quite, you know, at this rate, it's going to take us some time. Our aim is to have a month every summer, which will start on the glorious 12th.